My name is Alina, and for 17 years I believed I understood the man I married. David was like a comfortable, well-worn chair, solid, reliable, and always there. He was a software engineer, a man of quiet routines and logical solutions. Our life was a tapestry of shared habits, Saturday morning pancakes, evening walks with the dog, a mutual understanding that needed few words. I mistook that peace for emptiness. I confused his steadfastness for a lack of passion. I was a fool. It all started when Mark joined the architectural firm where I work as a project coordinator. He was everything David wasn't: loud, effusive, with an energy that seemed to crackle in the air around him. He noticed things. He noticed my new haircut. He remembered a project I'd mentioned in passing weeks before. He made me feel fascinating. Our conversations began over project timelines and budget sheets, but they soon spilled over into coffee breaks, then into long lunches where we talked about art and travel, and all the dreams I'd packed away in the attic of my life alongside my old college textbooks. The first time I lied to David, it felt like a physical weight in my chest. I told him I was working late on a pressing proposal. Instead, I was sitting in a wine bar with Mark, listening to him talk about his divorce and his desire for a fresh start. I remember the way the candlelight flickered in his eyes, and how his laughter seemed to draw everyone in the room toward him. I felt a thrill, a dangerous, addictive little spark that whispered I was still young, still desirable. I told myself it was just friendship, a harmless connection to ward off the midlife dullness I felt settling over me. I was building a beautiful, fragile castle out of lies, and I was the only one who couldn't see how flimsy the foundation was. At home, David was the same as ever. He'd ask about my day, and I'd give him the sanitized, edited version. He'd talk about his code, his roses, the new documentary he wanted us to watch. I started to feel a simmering resentment toward his predictability. His quiet contentment felt like a judgment on my restlessness. I began spending more and more time in my phone, the glow of the screen a beacon to my secret world, where Mark's words made me feel like the main character in my own story for the first time in years. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, David began to change. It was subtle, the way a season changes. He started working later, citing a complex new project that required his full attention. He seemed preoccupied, but in a focused way, not a worried one. He had a new light in his eyes, a sense of purpose that I hadn't seen since the early days of his career. I was so engrossed in my own clandestine drama that I barely paid it any mind. In fact, I was relieved. His absence gave me more freedom, more room to breathe in the intoxicating air of my double life. One evening, he came home and announced he decided to take up writing. I almost laughed. David, my man of numbers and logic, wanted to write. He said he needed a creative outlet, something to balance the binary nature of his work. He set up a small, sleek laptop on a desk in the corner of our bedroom, and most nights after dinner, he would retreat there, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a quiet intensity. I never asked what he was writing. I was too busy crafting my own narratives in text messages to Mark, stories where I was the misunderstood heroine and David was barely a secondary character. But a strange thing began to happen. The shine on my affair with Mark started to tarnish. His texts became less frequent. His promises to leave his unhappy past behind started to sound hollow, rehearsed. The thrilling unpredictability I had craved began to feel like simple unreliability. Meanwhile, at home, David was becoming more attentive on the nights he was present. He'd suggest we cook together, something we hadn't done in years. He remembered my favorite flower and brought home a bouquet of lilies for no reason. The contrast was dizzying. I was actively betraying him, and he was, inexplicably, trying to win me back. The guilt became a constant, cold companion, curling around my heart during the day and keeping me awake at night. I decided it had to end. The fantasy was collapsing under the weight of its own deception. I needed to break it off with Mark, to recommit to my marriage, to try and find my way back to the peace I had so carelessly discarded. I arranged to meet him one final time, in a neutral, public place, a botanical garden on the other side of the city. I told David I was going to spend the afternoon with a friend, needing some girl time. He simply nodded from his desk, his eyes not leaving his screen. "Have a good time, Alina," he said, his voice even. That should have been my first warning. The David I knew would have looked up, would have asked which friend, would have told me to say hello. This new David just kept typing. I drove to the garden with a determined knot in my stomach. The day was bright and sunny, a cruel contrast to the storm brewing inside me. I saw Mark waiting by the fountain just as we'd agreed. But as I walked closer, my steps faltered, then froze completely. He wasn't alone. Sitting on the stone bench beside him, posture relaxed and conversational, was David. My David. They were talking. There was no tension, no anger in their body language. It looked like a casual meeting between two old colleagues. The world seemed to slow down, the sounds of the garden fading into a dull roar in my ears. Mark saw me first, and his face went pale, his eyes wide with a panic I felt echoing in my own soul. Then David turned. He looked at me, and his expression was not one of shock or rage. It was one of profound, unnerving calm. He stood, said something quietly to Mark, who immediately stood and walked away without a single glance in my direction. Then David began to walk toward me. Each step was measured, deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, and in that familiar, steady voice that now sounded like a stranger's, he said, "Hello, Alina. I think it's time we went home and had a talk. Don't you?" In that moment, the beautiful castle of lies I had built crumbled into dust, and I realized the quiet, predictable man I had taken for granted had not been oblivious at all. He had been architecting his own designs all along. The drive home was a silence so profound it felt like a physical entity, a third person in the car sucking all the air out. He didn't look at me, didn't speak. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, his posture relaxed, as if we were just returning from a mundane errand. I, on the other hand, was a statue of pure panic, my mind a frantic whirlpool of hows and whys. How long had he known? What had he and Mark been discussing? Why wasn't he yelling? The absence of his anger was more terrifying than any outburst could ever be. We walked into our house, and it no longer felt like ours. It felt like a stage after the play has ended, all the props familiar but the meaning gone. He went straight to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water from the filter pitcher, the simple, everyday act feeling like a bizarre parody of normalcy. He leaned against the counter, took a slow sip, and looked at me. "Sit down, Alina," he said. His voice was calm, devoid of the tremor of rage I expected, and that made it all the more absolute. I collapsed into one of the wooden chairs at the kitchen table, my legs finally giving way. "David, please, let me explain," I begged, the words tasting like ash. "There's no need for explanations," he replied, setting his glass down with a soft, definitive click. "I know it all. I know about the first business lunch at Giovanni's, the one where you told him you felt unseen. I know about the text you sent from our bathroom the night of our anniversary, saying you wished you were with him. I know you told him my quietness felt like a prison." A cold dread, colder than I have ever known, seeped into my bones. He knew the words. The private, stupid, cliched words I had whispered and typed, thinking they were encased in a secret world. "How?" The question was a choked whisper. He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile that never reached his eyes. "My writing, Alina, it was never just a hobby." He walked to the kitchen table where his laptop sat, closed and silent. He opened it, the screen glowing to life, and turned it toward me. On the screen was a word processor document. The title made the room tilt, The Project Manager by David Ellis. "Read the first few pages," he instructed, his tone that of a teacher directing a student. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely control the trackpad. I scrolled down. And then I saw my life, my thoughts, my secret affair, laid bare in stark, beautifully precise prose. The protagonist was a woman named Alina, married to a dependable, methodical man named Daniel. She meets a charismatic contractor named Marcus. The details were ours, the specific wine bar, the exact dialogue from our text exchanges, the internal monologue of my guilt and my self-justification. He had captured my voice, my inner turmoil, with a devastating, surgical accuracy. He had written my own story, and he had written it with a clarity I had never possessed while living it. I don't understand," I stammered, tears of sheer, undiluted shame streaming down my face. This was a violation deeper than any I had committed. He hadn't just discovered my secrets, he had dissected them. "It's really quite straightforward," David said, closing the laptop with a soft snap. "When I first noticed the shift in you, the new light in your eyes that wasn't for me, the phone that was suddenly always password locked, the emotional distance. I didn't get mad. I got analytical. I am, at my core, a problem solver. And you, Alina, presented a fascinating problem. So I gathered data. A keylogger on your laptop gave me every email, every instant message, every forgotten draft you ever typed. You invaded my privacy, I cried out, a last, desperate attempt to claim some moral ground. I conducted an investigation, he corrected, his voice still dangerously level. And the data I compiled told a story, a trite, painfully common story. But I thought with the right narrative framework it could become something more. So I decided to write it, to process the betrayal through structure and character arc. But every story needs a compelling third act. He then explained, in that same calm, procedural tone, how he had found Mark. It had been simple. He used the information from our chats, showed up at his apartment one evening. David, my quiet husband, had stood in Mark's doorway and without a raised voice, laid out the entire situation. He showed him printed transcripts of our most intimate digital conversations. He told him he was writing a novel based on it, a novel that would use real names and real, damning details. Mark is fundamentally a weak man, David said, a note of disdain finally coloring his words. And image-conscious. The prospect of being the villain in a published book, of having his professional reputation shattered and his personal life become a source of gossip, was persuasive. He was exceedingly cooperative after our little chat. Our meeting in the garden was the denouement. I needed to witness the moment of revelation. I needed to see the facade crumble. I was utterly broken. This wasn't the revenge of a passionate man betrayed. This was the calculated, intellectual vengeance of a mind I had profoundly underestimated. He hadn't screamed or thrown things. He had authored my humiliation. So what happens now? I asked, my voice hollow. You publish that thing, you destroy me. David looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a glimpse of the pain beneath the icy calm. It was deep and old, a wound I had inflicted that had already scarred over in the strangest way. No, Alina, publication was never the primary objective. The writing was my therapy. The real revenge is this. He gestured vaguely around the room, at the space between us. This, you sitting there, knowing that I know every pathetic, cliched thought that crossed your mind. Knowing that the man you risked our life for was so easily unmasked and folded. Knowing that the husband you considered boring and predictable is someone you never truly knew at all. You will live with this knowledge every single day. You will have to look at me and see the man who outmaneuvered you, who turned your emotional affair into a creative writing project. You will have to decide, each morning, if you can bear to live in this house, with this man, with this unspoken manuscript forever between us. He stood up, looking down at me from what felt like a great height. The book is finished. I've already submitted the manuscript to several literary agents. It's received encouraging feedback. Whether it gets published or not is now in the hands of the market. It exists. Your confession, written in my hand, that is your sentence. Now, if you'll excuse me, my roses need watering. And he walked out the back door, leaving me alone in the crushing silence of the kitchen, staring at the closed laptop that held the blueprint of my downfall, written by the quiet, terrifying stranger I had married. The silence that settled over our house after that day in the garden was not an empty one. It was a heavy, living thing, thick with the words he had written and the truths I could never unsay. We became experts in a new, terrible dance. David moved through the rooms with a quiet purpose, going to work, tending his garden, typing occasionally on his laptop. He was polite, even courteous. He'd ask if I wanted coffee. He'd tell me he'd be home late. He'd discuss the weather. It was a performance of normalcy, so flawless it was chilling. I was the one coming apart at the seams. I tried once to break the facade. I waited for him in the living room one night, the lights dim, and I poured my heart out. I spoke of my regret, my profound shame, how I missed the man I had married. I begged for us to find a way, to see a counselor, to try and rebuild from the ashes. He listened, his head tilted, his expression one of detached curiosity, as if I were a peculiar specimen under a microscope. When I finished, breathless and tearful, he said, I appreciate you saying that, Alina, but my process of healing is largely complete. The book was my therapy. You'll need to find your own path to yours. He had reframed his vengeance as his personal journey to wellness, and in doing so, left me utterly alone in my penance. There was no fight to have, no door to slam, only this immense, quiet victory of his. Weeks bled into months. The waiting was its own special torture. Every time the phone rang, every time he checked his email, my heart would stutter. Was this the moment? Had an agent called? Had a publisher offered a deal? I was living on death row, waiting for a reprieve or an execution date, and David was the warden who never gave any sign. Then one ordinary Tuesday it happened. He was at his desk, and I was pretending to read a book when he let out a soft, satisfied sigh. It wasn't a sound of excitement, but of culmination. He turned his laptop around. On the screen was an email from a literary agent. The subject line read, "Offer of representation, the project manager." My blood ran cold. "They love it," David said, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in what felt like years. "They say the voice is authentic and compelling. They particularly admire the nuanced portrayal of the wife's interiority." I felt sick. They were praising him for his insight into my betrayal. The book moved quickly after that. The agent secured a deal with a notable publisher. David would disappear for meetings, returning with a new, quiet confidence. He was no longer just my husband. He was an author with a future. My crime had become his capital. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making, forced to watch the man I had betrayed build a new, successful identity on the foundation of my infidelity. The final, exquisite twist of the knife came the day the advance copies arrived. A box was delivered to the house. David opened it with the reverence of a new father. He pulled out a book. The cover was elegant, stark. The title, "The Project Manager," glared back at me, and there on the back cover was his author photo. He looked thoughtful, intelligent, and completely at peace. He handed me a copy. "I'd like you to have this," he said. "I've inscribed it for you." With trembling hands, I opened the front cover. There, in his precise handwriting, it read, "For Alina, without whom this story would not have been possible. Thank you for the inspiration." David. I looked up at him, the world swimming in my tears. This was it. This was the final, complete victory. He wasn't just humiliating me in private anymore. He was immortalizing my failure, publishing it for the world to see, and then, with breathtaking cruelty, thanking me for it. He had taken the most shameful period of my life and turned it into his proudest achievement. "The publication party is next week," he continued, his voice light, conversational. "At the Gibson Gallery. It's quite a nice venue. You're welcome to come, of course, though I'd understand if you'd prefer not to." I could only stare, mute. The gallery. The very place where Mark and I had met for one of our secret lunches. David knew. Of course he knew. He knew everything. The night of the party, I stayed home. I sat in the dark living room, imagining the scene. The clinking glasses, the admiring murmurs, David, the poised and intriguing new author, gracefully accepting congratulations for a book that detailed the destruction of his marriage. He would be the sympathetic hero, the brilliant man who channeled his pain into art. I would be the cliché, the unfaithful wife, a footnote in his success story. He came home late, smelling of wine and expensive perfume. He wasn't drunk, but he was buoyant, a quiet triumph radiating from him. He looked at me sitting in the dark and simply nodded. "It was a success," he said. "The book is going into a second printing." That was when I finally understood the full, devastating scope of his revenge. It wasn't about divorcing me, about throwing me out. It was about making me a permanent resident in the prison of my own mistake. He had not only exposed my affair, he had monetized it. He had not only stolen my narrative, he had published it under his own name. He would prosper from my sin, and I would have to live in this house with this man and watch him do it. Every royalty check, every positive review, every translated edition would be a fresh reminder. He had taken my betrayal and, with the calm precision of a master engineer, had built a glorious, unassailable monument to it. And my punishment was to forever live in its shadow. The quiet, reliable man had not just gotten even. He had ensured he would forever be winning.